Hello, guys and gals, and welcome to another episode of Skills and Abilities. Today we're going to be going over the Necromancer Poison and Bone skill known as Bone Spear. Bone Spear has been a love-hate relationship of mine for a very long time. I actually preferred what it was before they added the synergies. Those of you who are from the old days in Classic, shout out in the comments, by the way. I'd love to hear how many of you played back in the Classic days. You guys know what I'm talking about. You could just put 20 points into Bone Spear and you could move on with your day. And a lot of the times, it was very fun to build like a Summon Necromancer with 20 points in Bone Spear. And because the synergies didn't exist, you had a pretty functional ability that you could utilize with your army. However, nowadays, you can't really do that. Bone Spear has so many synergies attached to it at this point. Building it with something else is almost ludicrous. Like, it's not even an option. It requires 20 points in the skill itself, which is already, obviously the minimum that you would put into any ability anyway. Then 40, then 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. To max out Bone Spear, it is 100 points. At level 95, you've got 106 points to move to actually utilize. You've already spent one of them on Corpse Explosion right here. So you have 5 points left. You spend another one on Bone Armor right here. You have 4 points left. So if you max out Bone Spear, you've got a whole 4 points to use elsewhere. You could put 1 point in Skeleton Mastery, 1 point in Raised Skeleton, and then you could throw 1 point in Clay Golem and 1 point in Golem Mastery, and you wouldn't even have enough to throw a point in Summon Resistance. That's how ridiculously silly Bone Spear is now. To get the maximum effect from this ability, you really need to just dig deep into your skill point reservoir and get as many points as you possibly can into these abilities, which often leaves necromancers that are building into this particular tree very skill point deprived, which is why things like the white bone wand tend to be extremely very, very, very valuable for this particular build. White wands are essentially a special wand that allows you to kind of customize the wand to a more specific requirement. Unlike things like Death's Web, which I have here, you can find a base that will have, for instance, +1 to Crepify, plus, 1 Summon Resist, +1 Golem Mastery, +1 Revive, things like that, which, as you can see, are pretty far down the tree, right? So if I'm already in the process of building a Bone Spear Necromancer that is, obviously going to eat up every single point that I have to get him to the point where he can actually dish out decent damage, I'm going to be looking for those magical white wands that have the right skills on them, so I don't have to use skill points to go down. Because think for an instant, if I wanted to get Decrepify, how many points do I have to spend to get Decrepify? I have to spend 1, 2, 3, 4 points to get to Decrepify. That's 4 points I don't have as a Poison and Bone Necromancer. If I want 1 point in Revive, I have to spend 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 points to get down to Revive. So if I can find a wand that has +3 Revive on it to make my Necromancer Bone Spear wand, I can potentially save myself 6 points right there. I can also save myself 4 points by finding a wand that has Decrepify. And so the hunt for the magical Bone Spear wand commences at this point. So if you plan to build this particular character, you're going to be hunting for those ridiculously nice bases. You're going to be looking for something that has +3 Bone Spear with +1 Decrepify and +1 Revive. You're going to be looking for things for +1 Summon Resist and +1 Summon Golem Mastery, so that you don't have to put points into those. There are hundreds of different combinations, of course, that you could get that would potentially make things much easier on this particular Necromancer. Even things like lower resistance, if you wanted to help out your teammates, life tap, all sorts of interesting things. In fact, you could even have 2 or 3 white wands with various skills on them, so that you didn't have to go through the process of having to put points in any of those. And since most of the curses are 1 point wonders, curses tend to be very easy as an example for this. Now, what about this skill itself? How well does it work? Well, it's a little underwhelming. I feel like we have to talk about like Bone Spear in its maximum potential, and Bone Spear, well, doesn't really do very well even in its maximum potential. So I'm not sure exactly why it is, and I've built several Bone Spear Necromancers. The Bone Spear ability itself just really doesn't dish out enough damage. Despite the fact that it can pierce, which is very powerful, and is what makes it more powerful than Bone Spirit, which cannot pierce. Despite the fact that Bone Spirit has a higher magical damage, it doesn't really do anywhere near as much as something like Bone Spear, especially when you consider the fact that you can pierce the effect into other targets. So, for instance, if I were to go out here into something like the Canyon of the Magi and start shooting off Bone Spears, there's a very good chance that my Bone Spear, which does 4,950 damage, or let's just round it up to 5k, is going to hit more than one target at a time. And because it hits more than one target, I can dish out 2, 3, 4, sometimes even 5 or 6 times the damage that I could with Bone Spirit. And basically how this works is, unlike with Amazon bow skills, Bone Spear can continue piercing the entire duration of its travel time. So if I were to stand at this pillar right here and shoot off a Bone Spear, you can clearly see that it goes all the way to this pillar right here. Anything in between these two targets that gets touched by Bone Spear will immediately be hit for that magic damage. And that's another interesting point in Bone Spear's favor, is that it is indeed magical damage. And it is also another point in, unfortunately, against it. And you might be asking, well, how can magic damage be a point against it when magic damage is also a point for it? The answer to that question lies in the fact that nothing can reduce or increase magic resistance. So think about it like this. If you have a monster that is immune to lightning, you can take that monster's immunity and you can reduce it. Okay? And you can potentially reduce it to 0, which is the same as magic damage. All right? So if I have negative 95% enemy lightning resistance and I'm using a lightning sunder, I can reduce any monster that's immune to lightning to 0% resistance, which will effectively be the exact same thing as magic damage. However, if I have more than negative 95% lightning resistance, negative, I can bring that monster down from 0 to negative 100, which means I can now effectively double the damage output that I'm doing. Magic damage cannot do that. It cannot bring a monster down to negative 100%. There is no way to reduce it lower than 0. So your damage will always be 4,950. Whereas the lightning user, if he's doing 4,950 lightning damage, he can reduce the monster down to 0 and gain all of his 4,950, and then he can reduce the monster down to negative 100 and double it. So now he's doing effectively 10,000 damage, and you're still just doing 4,950. And so in this way, magic damage is both a good and a bad thing, because when you come across a monster, you're at least guaranteed to get the exact amount of damage that's written on the skill, but there is also no way to increase your damage further. So the damage that you get is the damage you get is the damage that you get. And it's kind of not enough. So when you go to, say, Hell difficulty, and you start fighting monsters that are a little bit more powerful than otherwise you would normally fight. In fact, let me take a character that's actually set up for maximum Bone Spear. I believe he has level 59 Bone Spear, so he's currently at 8,280 damage per spear, which isn't too terrible. That's not too bad. And we're going to change this to P8. Make sure we're on P8. And let's even go somewhere that it's in favor for the Necromancer. So there are definitely some zones in the game that, as far as Bone Spear is concerned, Like, the Necromancer has a fun, happy, fun time in these zones. And when I say happy, fun time, I mean happy, dappy, fun time. And that's zones like Far Oasis. So in Far Oasis, all the monsters line up for you in a nice little line. Like, they're absolutely almost, what's the term? Like, just waiting for you to kill them. And so when you fire your Bone Spear in Far Oasis's Maggot Lair, what you're going to get is you're going to get the maximum damage output that you can possibly get for Bone Spear, because, well, they're basically letting you, right? And let's find a nice little group here. So as you can see, I can shoot my Bone Spear down this line, and I can kill the targets in this line. And as long as they're nice and lined up like this, you can see the damage output for Bone Spear is actually pretty nice. However, when they're not lined up, I've got to kill them one at a time. Now, this is the maximum that you're probably ever going to get out of Bone Spear. This is like 100 and, like 6 points just like spent strictly into Bone Spear and wearing all of the right items for Bone Spear that you can ever possibly wear. Things like the White Wand, having all of the plus to skill equipment in Poison and Bone Skillers, making sure that you're wearing 2 Soges. You've got on a plus skill amulet. Of course, none of this stuff is legitimate. I've got this stuff all hacked in. And even in the case of having like the maximum ability that you could possibly have, it still takes a little while to kill the monsters. And you're not going to reach these heights. That's part of the problem. These heights are incredibly difficult to get to. Having the perfect White Wand, which this is actually a very good white base. As you can see here, we have +3 Poison and Bone skills. We've got +3 Bone Spirit, +3 Decrepify, +5 Bone Spear, and then it also has the +4 Skeleton Mastery and the Bone Armor. So we've got effectively, what is that, 5, 6, 7, 8, +8 Bone Spear with +6 to Bone Spirit on here. And even our Bone Spirit is level 57 with a damage output of 8,406. And it's just one of those abilities that, like, as you utilize it, as you actually go in and you try and get it to work, you'll find that it works better in areas like these where everything lines up for you, because you can dish out so much damage in this line. One cast, is, what, 8,280. But 8,280 times 15 monsters that are all nice and lined up for you, that's 8,280 times 15. It's probably something like, what, 160,000 damage or something like that. I don't even know. My quick math is absolutely terrible. But it's still not going to compare to something like the Javazon. It's never going to compare to something like the Hammerden, which can dish out, what is it, like an average hammer damage for a fully geared Hammerden, I want to say is something like, what, 11k? Let's say 11k hammers. The hammers can hit every target in a circle, like as many times. It can actually hit a target multiple times. It doesn't disappear. So it has the same piercing effect that Bone Spear does, and all without the same restrictions that Bone Spear does. So Bone Spear only goes in a straight line, whereas the hammer can spin, and it spins for quite some time, and it could potentially hit anywhere between one monster to anywhere like 30 or even sometimes 40 monsters, depending on how densely packed the group of monsters is. And the damage output is just ridiculously different by comparison. Where the Bone Spear Necromancer needs a very specific path that all his monsters have to stand in to be able to get the same kind of benefit, the Hammerden can sit in the middle of a group of monsters, fire off, 10, 20 hammers, and literally just decimate the entire group. Damage-wise, it's not even close, unfortunately. And I think, honestly, Bone Spear and Bone Spirit need... I don't want to say that they need buffs. They need diversity in the way that they can be built. 100 skill points to get to this level is too many skill points. It's just too many. They need to remove at the bare minimum, at least one of these synergies and bump up the rest. I would really honestly like to see maybe Bone Wall or Bone Prison taken off the list, and maybe both of them taken off the list, so that you can actually take this particular character, build say 20, 40, 60 points in, and then build something else as well. Because for what you get for 100 skill points, or rather actually it's 101, 102, 102 skill points. For how much you get for 102 skill points, it's not quite worth it. Especially when other classes can do this or better with like 20, 40, 60, 20, 40. Like you can effectively build a Skellymancer for 20, 40 points. And it's a very effective class. It might not be quite as fast as something like a Poison Nova Necromancer, but think about it like this: 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. The Poison Necromancer can build Poison Nova, and he can also build skeletons. So effectively, the Poison Nova Necromancer can be two things. The Poison and Bone Necromancer, on the other hand, though, has no choice. He's forced into having these specific skills and nothing else, and it does make for a very tiresome, very just restrictive build. As soon as you say to yourself, "I want to build a Bone Spear Necromancer," you have essentially pigeonholed yourself into building a 100-point poison, Bone Spear. And if you don't, let's say what happens if you don't. So, let me go ahead and reset these skill points real quick. And let me just show you what happens if you don't. So let's say, for instance, that you just decided you didn't want to build all the synergies for Bone Spear. Maybe you just put the points into Bone Spear, and then you put the points into Bone Spirit, and you decided you really didn't want maybe the Wall and the Prison, or maybe you didn't want Teeth, one or the other. Maybe you only built one of the other synergies. Maybe you threw 20 points into Teeth. You notice that my damage is half of what it was before. Despite the fact that I'm still at level 56 Bone Spear, I'm now only dishing out 4,551 damage per shot, as opposed to before I was dishing out nearly 8,000 damage in the same regard. And this is kind of like the silly thing that goes on with Bone Spear, is even missing just one or two synergies so that you can try and cross build into something else. It nerfs the damage to the point where you really aren't going to be able to kill too much. And the other thing is that Bone Spirit, which, while I kind of like Bone Spirit, especially back in the day, I thought Bone Spirit was really cool. It doesn't have a whole lot of PvE uses when Bone Spear does so much better. Like damage-wise, if you look at the damage between the two, Bone Spirit has 7,940 damage here, and Bone Spear is 7,725. They're essentially the same, right? So why would you ever fire Bone Spirit instead of Bone Spear? If you can potentially hit multiple targets, for instance, if I'm shooting one or two targets, like say for instance we've got a pack of targets here, right? I could fire one Bone Spirit and hit one of them, or I could potentially fire a Bone Spear hitting all of them. And this also kind of makes the entire tree silly. So here's kind of like an odd thing, right? So if you were to build a Summon Necromancer, right? Let's say you put a bunch of points into Golem Mastery. You could potentially use any of the Golems if you wanted to. You have kind of like a diverse skill set here. So you could potentially use a Clay Golem when you need it. You could maybe switch to a Blood Golem if you were having trouble with your life. You could switch to a Iron Golem if you wanted a free Meditation Merc. You could utilize the Skeletal Mages, even though they're not like the greatest, but they definitely still work. But over here on the poison tree, with the poison and bone skills, teeth is essentially useless, right? So you can't really use it for much of anything. Bone Spirit is also essentially useless. It does have some very specific PvP uses, and we'll go over that in the Bone Spirit video. But as far as PvE is concerned, if you're building a bone necromancer, Bone Spear is by far the superior choice in almost every regard. The only time Bone Spirit ever becomes useful is when you're trying to kill somebody around an object. So, like, sometimes when you're in like a tight zone, what you can do is you can like fire the Bone Spirit near the edge of something, and the Bone Spirit will often like seek the target. But one of the things that like has really gotten weird in some of the later patches, and not in the earlier patches, by the way, because those of you who are from Classic will remember that Bone Spirit used to seek better than it does now. You used to be able to take it like this and fire it at a corner, and it would automatically seek to the target. You didn't have to fire it directly at the monster. But as you can see here, unless the monster is almost directly next to the corner, it's having trouble doing its seeking. Somewhere along the line, they changed Bone Spirit to the point where it doesn't quite seek as well as it used to. And the same thing for Guided Arrow, too, if you've, I'm not sure if you've noticed, but Guided Arrow doesn't quite seek as well as it did back in, say, 1.09. That unfortunately gives the only advantage that Bone Spirit has over Bone Spear, kind of like a smack in the face, because then you can't use it for the fun stuff that you used to use it for back in the day. And Bone Spear, again, becomes the superior choice in like 99% of scenarios. And I really wish they hadn't changed the sound effect. I do like the old sound effect so much better. But as you can see, if we are in the optimal configuration, if we have all of the skill points spent, if we have all of the equipment that we need, if we're running all of the poison and bone skillers, then we can effectively make a very powerful Bone Spear Necromancer. However, one of the issues with this is that if you don't have all the skillers, if you don't have all the plus to skills, if you don't have the white wand, if you don't have everything that you need, Bone Spear tends to be kind of lackluster and doesn't really perform quite well. And I don't really know how to explain it other than that. Like, it's a very expensive build, both in terms of equipment and skill points. And a lot of necromancers would really like to have probably some other stuff to go along with their army. And well, they can't for the most part. You're like I said, you're very restricted in the terms of what you can do with this build and still maintain your maximum damage output. And sacrificing even just 20 points from one of these abilities will severely nerf this damage down. Just to give you an idea, I'm going to put 20 points into everything except for one synergy, and show you guys kind of what it looks like if you don't build one synergy. As you can see, I've lost basically about 25% of my damage. I'm 6,490, where I was very close to, what was it, 8,280. A 25% damage loss just from those 20 points. It's not like other abilities where you can just skimp a little bit and you'll be okay. Like, you skimp on this ability and you miss out on massive amounts of damage. And there's no way to increase it. Unlike with the skeletons that you can use amplify damage for, unlike with the mages that you could use lower resistance for, or Poison Nova that you can use lower resistance for, there's no way to beef up that damage any further than it ever is going to be. So it's always going to be what's stated on the ability. And then when you fight those monsters that are resistant to magic damage, which quite a few monsters in the game are resistant to magic damage, like for instance Uber Diablo, Uber Mephisto, Uber Bale, Pandemonium Diablo. A lot of the bosses have a magical damage modifier that is automatically resistant. In fact, let me pull up Uber Mephisto real quick. And Uber Mephisto's magic resistance, he is always 75% magic resistant. So when you are fighting Uber Mephisto with a Bone Spear Necromancer, you take your 8,280 and you subtract 75% from that, and that's how much damage you're doing to Uber Mephisto when you fight him with a Bone Spear Necromancer. And that is going to give us what? Let's run it on the calculator real quick, which is 8,280 minus 75%. So we're dishing out about 2,070 damage per Bone Spear. It's not very impressive when you think about like the monsters that do have resistance to your abilities. And obviously with things like the new Sunder Charms that have come out, I mean, 95% resistant magic immunes aren't really going to do you much good either. So like when you fight a 95% resistant magic immune, you're looking at what? 8,280 minus 95% is a whole 414 damage left over, which isn't really going to kill much of anything. I'm not trying to talk the ability down. Don't get me wrong. I just think that for what you get, for the investment that you have to put in for this ability, it's a little lackluster. You can't really do Ubers with Bone Spear Necromancers. That's not really a thing. You don't really have the ability to decrease the resistance of any monster that you do come across that is magic immune. I would imagine doing declone with a Bone Spear Necromancer would be pretty painful. And just the sheer point investment that you have to go through for this is painful. In fact, Bone Spear, I think, and Bone Spirit Necromancers tend to be more of a PvP class than anything, because obviously players don't have any magic resistance. We're always at 0 unless you're using that one item in the entire game that has magic resistance, which is the safety shield, and it's not very much at that. And you can utilize both of these abilities very well in PvP. In fact, they're both required. Like if you're going to use all of these, you can utilize Bone Spirit by running with the Bone Spirits. One of the most interesting things is just to fire off a volley of Bone Spirits and then follow them. This is because when anybody telestomps you, they will telestomp directly into the Bone Spirits, essentially doing lots of damage to themselves. And then, of course, when you come across those players that have lots of minions, like, for instance, the Druids and, like the other Necromancers, perhaps, that have this army of monsters around them to help protect them from damage output, the Bone Spirit, of course, pierces through everything, and you don't necessarily have to worry about the fact that they have that army. And even Teeth sees some decent use in PvP. But it's really the PvE Bone Necromancer that kind of gets the shaft in terms of, like, just his overall usefulness as a character. Now, maybe if the Bone Spear Necromancer could do a little bit of, cross-building, as I said earlier, into, like, the raised skeletons, maybe build a powerful golem. There's a couple other things that could potentially be done to help the Necromancer be a little bit more useful as far as the Poison and Bone Necromancer goes. And maybe return him a little bit to his luster back in Classic, where you could just drop 20 points into Bone Spear, build a Summon Necromancer, grab a good Golem, and have a blast, throw in Bone Spears while your army's doing its thing. But it's really not quite possible these days with the 100 skill point investment. And I feel like I'm kind of repeating myself at this point, so it's probably a good time to end the video. As always, I do appreciate you guys and gals watching my videos, even when we're talking for 30 minutes about Bone Spear. And as always, keep watching.